when I share my screen, I can't see myself anymore.
Okay.
So, okay.
Great. Well,
I'll
good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 Spring Educational Conference for the North Carolina Public Health Association. Katie Griffin, Executive Director of the Association, and we are thrilled that you are here today. We apologize for the slight delay in start time. We've been having some technical difficulties, but we are thrilled to return to in-person conferences this fall at our fall conference in Asheville. But for this virtual conference, we appreciate your patience with us as we work through technical difficulties. I'm going to soon introduce our president of the association, but before I do, just want you to know that we may have some changes to the agenda this morning, and again, we appreciate your flexibility. So with all of that said, before I turn it over, I do want to thank Kim Dittman, the operations officer for the North Carolina Public Health Association, for all of her hard work setting up this conference, and we look forward to a great day with you all. Thanks. Mike?
Yes. Hey, thank you, Katie. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our 2021 NCPHA Spring Education Conference. So excited to have you all here. As Katie mentioned, thank you all for your patience. We've been adapting for over a year now to all these circumstances popping up, and here we are again. But as Katie mentioned, we all look forward to being back in person this fall with the Fall Educational Conference. So I won't take long, but we have a minor change to our agenda to start things off. We are going to shift Jean Matthews' presentation to 10:30 and start with Dawn Hunter and Elizabeth Thomas. And they will be presenting a workshop entitled Skill Building to Create More Equitable Messages Using the Foundational Moral Values Framework. I'll start by introducing Dawn Hunter. Dawn is a deputy director with the Southeastern region of the Network for Public Health Law. She provides legal technical assistance to state and local health departments, policymakers, and public health professionals and organizations. She also conducts legal research and policy analysis and provides training on law and policy as tools to protect and promote public health. Dawn's work focuses on health and racial equity, civic engagement, and public health agency structure, organization, and accreditation. We're very fortunate to have Dawn Hunter with us today. Many of you have heard her even in recent weeks at the legal conference, and she is a wonderful resource for us. And presenting alongside Dawn is Elizabeth Thomas. Elizabeth is a community engagement coordinator for the North Carolina Institute for Public Health at the UNC Gillings School for Global Public Health. As part of the Community Assessment and Strategy team at NCIPH, she translates expertise and best practices from UNC Gillings to practical real-world solutions and strategies for partners. She's also an enthusiastic storyteller for her organization, and as a communications lead, she gets to share its accomplishments and resources and help others do the same. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dawn and Elizabeth, and thank you both for being here, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, we are excited to be here, and thanks for everyone's patience as we flip our presentation agenda just a little bit, and Dawn's pulling up our slides. Our presentation will still make sense even though we're not doing Jean's part first as we usually do. So I'll just wait just a second while Dawn pulls up. There we go. Awesome. So you can go ahead and go to my next slide, Dawn. So I'm going to talk a little bit about empathy and storytelling and communicating around COVID-19 and vaccination. And when I talk about empathy, I do like to start out a little bit with acknowledging that we're still in a communications crisis with public health, and to take a moment to acknowledge that we all need to have some empathy for ourselves right now, and to recognize that we're not going to reach every single person, and that would just be an unrealistic goal, and to just be empathetic and kind to ourselves. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. So why do we talk about empathy, though? We talk about it because relationships are the foundation of public health. Relationships with our community, with our partners, with our stakeholders. It gives us a chance to reframe and to connect and we cannot make connections without empathy. And also because public health is a long game, we're always going to have things to work on, improve, aim for, and we cannot just, focus on just this one issue. So we have to be trusted messengers. We have to have people remember and that we showed up and that we were empathetic and that we were listening and engaging in a genuine way. So next slide. So as I'm talking in these next couple of slides, think about some of the things you've heard during the pandemic that you could probably be more empathetic about. And I know that I've heard some things that I just wanted to bang my head against the wall about, things like, COVID isn't real, COVID isn't a big deal, COVID was unleashed on us on purpose. It's no more than a common cold. The vaccine is a conspiracy, et cetera, et cetera. So just thinking about some of those messages. And then next slide, please. We're going to think a little bit about how we can reframe some of the stories that we tell ourselves. So we're talking a little bit about storytelling today in Dawn's presentation and mine. And also during lunchtime, I know we're going to have a speaker about storytelling. And I think that's really important because you may have heard the phrase that the mind is a meaning-making machine. And basically what that means is that as we go through our daily lives, we are always constantly telling ourselves stories about the world around us. We're not necessarily consciously aware of doing it, but we are doing it. And when you hear things that just drive us crazy during the pandemic, we start telling ourselves some really unempathetic stories about the people who are saying those things. And it's really important as we're trying to connect and be genuine in our work that we take a moment to just take a deep breath and recognize that we do this, and also to try to understand that there's a person behind that and that we can maybe have some empathy for that. So we try to reframe by asking ourselves some questions like, why would a reasonable, rational, decent person do what this person is doing? Or to put it in a moral foundations framework kind of language, why would a person who values care and fairness say what that person is saying? Next slide. And then, of course, there's the listening part of empathy is going to be really important. And so everyone here has been to a workshop or a training session or has read a book or an article about active listening, which is really empathetic listening. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just a reminder that we have to be really humble and curious when we're listening to whether it's a group of stakeholders or a person one-on-one in front of us. We have to really ask them a lot of questions, and we have to really listen to what they're saying and try to understand it from their point of view. And that can mean asking really good questions like, what's your perspective? Tell me more about that. Can you give me an example? But I also like to remind people that the person in front of us has a set of lived experience that are just as valid as our own. And also that a lot of the times when we're listening, we're not really listening, we're performing listening. And just to be aware of that and to try to go beyond performing listening and to really listen and understand. Next slide. A good example of this is that story that I think a lot of us have heard Mandy Cohen tell back when she was famous for talking about Medicaid transformation and not famous for her press conferences with Roy Cooper, about being a young medical student and having a patient who was presenting this mysterious set of symptoms, and she was testing for all these diseases, and what she wasn't really doing was listening and being empathetic and understanding that the patient was dealing with hunger. So it's really about listening and kind of hearing what that person really needs to tell you. Next slide, please. So of course, it's not just listening and connecting, it's also about we are trying to communicate and hopefully change some people's minds or be influential. So a quick poll. I don't think we didn't have our first slide at the beginning of the original presentation agenda. So if you have a moment and can pull up a browser window, there's some instructions at the top of the slide, or you can pull up your phone and in the, instead of texting to a regular phone number, you would text to 22333. And in the body of the text message, you text Dawn Hunter 984. And then once you do that, it's going to say you're part of the poll. And then you can answer this poll. So the poll question, as you can see, is, have you been successful in changing anyone's mind about the vaccine? And I'm just really curious to hear whether people in this audience have successfully changed anyone's mind about the vaccine. So I'd love it if you guys could take a moment to answer this question. And I apologize for not having given you a second to get instructions about the poll everywhere before this. As you know, we had to change our agenda around a little bit, and we did originally have some instructions about this earlier in the presentation. So yeah, a couple of people still working on it. Haven't need to. No one is really bugging me. I can totally sympathize with that. No messaging ninjas yet. I'm gonna give this just another second just because I don't want to spend too much time on the poll, but I am really curious about it. And the poll will stay active. So, you know, if you want to answer it later on, you can, but still working on, a lot of people still working on, ooh, a messaging ninja, love it. That makes me really happy. For anyone who is a messaging ninja, please put in the chat what you did that made you successful. I would really like to hear about that. And a lot of people are still working on it, which is totally understandable, and we totally get it. So yeah, anybody who's been successful, really want to hear from you in the chat. Otherwise, let's go ahead and move on with the slides. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So how do we communicate and hopefully be influential with our audiences? First of all, we owe it to our audiences to be really clear with our messages. Be really candid. Be really don't be afraid to advocate. Don't try to hide behind clever little slogans and manipulate people. Tell them what you believe in and tell them why. And also tell your story. So next slide, please. Stories are really important and really influential. Facts are really important, and we must support our work with facts. And we are science believers in public health, and that's really important. But the truth is that people don't necessarily connect emotionally with data. We need to share facts as part of our credibility and our duty to educate, but we also want people to connect. And stories work on our emotions and our critical thinking, and they give a sense of mission and common cause and identity, and a sense of belonging. And they actually provoke oxytocin, which is the love hormone, is the bonding hormone. And they also create empathy and dopamine, and the payoff in a story elevates dopamine, which really helps lock it in and helps people remember things. So it's a really, really powerful tool in our messaging. And if we can give people a really good story that helps incorporate facts and information, it's a really good way of educating people and of helping them connect with us and with our messages. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we're always seeking to make meaning out of everything. We're helping people make meaning out of those messages when we can tell them a story. And it even helps people invest in inanimate objects. So, if I have my notes from the conference right here, they're not meaningful to anybody but me because it's just some notes on a piece of paper. But if I'm Beyonce and this is my set list, all of a sudden this might be valuable to everybody in the audience because, oh my gosh, I'm Beyonce and I'm really important and exciting. And this is also, you'd want this because it would be a memento of that amazing time you went to see Beyonce. So it's not just the object, it's what does that object mean to you? And the same thing, it's not just the fact that, this vaccine is, 97% effective against such and such disease. It's this vaccine helps me go forward and live my life. What is the story behind the thing? Next slide, please. So people are not data driven. John talks about this too, but there's this guy, Neil Bayer, who is a pediatrician and TV writer, which is this guy's living his best life. Wrote an episode of ER where they had a storyline about HPV, and they did some audience testing about people's awareness of HPV before and after, and then 6 weeks after the episode. And people who didn't know what HPV even was were able to define it after seeing the episode and retained accurate knowledge 6 weeks after seeing the episode. And they were aware that it caused cervical cancer after the episodes aired. And they retained that knowledge. And it, like statistically significant, it's like 25% jumps. So really, you can incorporate the storytelling techniques. It's really valuable. Next slide, please. Sorry, next. I'm going to skip this slide actually because I think I'm running out of time. But just be careful how you frame your stories, and that you have a responsibility to, as a storyteller, to be careful with your audiences. So again, with storytelling, think about the benefits that you're offering. What's in it for the person that you're talking to? The shot is not the benefit. Next slide. The benefit is getting together with your friends and your family, the people that you love, getting back to real life. This is the benefit. The story is go get your vaccine. You can take off that mask. You can hug your granddaughter. You can get together with your friends and celebrate a birthday. That is the story that you want to tell. Next slide, please. Some more tips. Do not shame or name call, especially like even on your own private social media. It's absolutely going to shut people down. Offer a sense of control when you can. Like, we have 3 different shots to offer you, and each of them has a great safety record. Enlist trusted partners. This one's really important, and I have a resource to share with you at the end of my presentation. But you're not always going to be the best messenger for every audience, and just be really aware of that and enlist all the friends and folks that you can, so that you can reach everybody where they are. Emphasize benefits over threats. So emphasize getting together with your family over COVID. And connect with what's meaningful to them, not to you. Controlling the pandemic is really meaningful to us. A lot of people are burnt out on that message. So connect with what's meaningful to your audience. Next slide. And then the de Beaumont Foundation has got some amazing resources on changing the COVID conversation. I'm going to put some links in the chat for you. But they've got communications cheat sheets. They have some polling data that's really interesting. They have some PSAs from GOP Congress people who are also doctors, saying why they have gotten the COVID vaccine. So if you want to talk about, getting messengers who are like your audiences, who are maybe not like you, those are some great resources you can share. I highly recommend that you guys all take a look at this if you haven't already. The New York Times also has a great op-ed that just came out this morning about, who are the hesitant folks who haven't gotten the COVID vaccine. I'm going to link that to you in the chat as well. It's really interesting. And they also have sort of a breakdown by state of like the proportions and some tips on reaching those audiences as well. I really appreciate your attention this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Dawn, whose presentation on equity is amazing. And I'm going to check out the chat as well, and looking forward to connecting with y'all there. Thanks so much.
Hi. Okay, great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I just have a couple of quick things. I want to check on the time that we have, because I want to make sure that we do leave time for some questions at the end. Are we still ending at 10:15?
Are you asking me, Dawn?
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Is there any of our backstage people on? Do you know what time we're ending? I just want to make sure I leave time.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. So I think it's 10:15. So I'm going to stop by 10 to make sure that we have. Just for the audience, there are some more poll everywhere questions. So if you texted to get into the poll, you can just stay in that text until we're done. And then same instructions apply. And I'm going to turn my video off because when I share my screen, I cannot actually see the conference screen. So, but Elizabeth, because of that, if there is any issue, please text me because I won't be able to see the chat or anything like that. Okay, so I'm going to go back. And hopefully this will allow me to share from the current slide. Okay, so are you seeing my current slide? Naming and framing.
Naming and framing, yes, you're good.
Yay, okay.
Now.
Okay, so thanks again. I'm glad to be here, and I'm going to go through some of this a little faster just because I do want to make sure that we have some time. And I'm starting with this. This is a quote from the Frameworks Institute. I'm sure many of y'all are already familiar with their research and their materials. But it says basically, we can't get to the America we want without talking about racial equity, structural racism, and racial and ethnic discrimination. But if communications aren't framed carefully, they can reinforce misconceptions about people of color and set back change. And I start with this because I think, the idea of naming and framing is a really important concept as we go through this material. So you have to name the issue. So we have to be able to say that's racism or whatever the issue is. And then we have to frame it appropriately for the audience. And when Jean goes, and to emphasize something Elizabeth was saying, you have to do that in a way that does not reinforce people's strongly held beliefs. So why do we do this and what does it mean? So centering equity, you're doing that in the content or in the outcome of your message. So the content might be you are specifically talking about a community that's impacted by COVID. It's a community of color. Maybe it's essential workers who are impacted, et cetera. An outcome is like you want people to do something that will create equity or in an equitable way. So that might be that you put out a message about food distribution sites in neighborhoods that are having some challenges with food security, and you do that in multiple languages. And why do we do these things? So you see some reasons listed here. The most important one, in my opinion, is to normalize conversations. So we know a lot of people are not comfortable talking about racial equity, for example, but we're never going to get comfortable if we don't have the conversation. So we have to get to a point where using this terminology is normal, but also recognize and meet people where they are. So the people who don't want to talk about structural racism doesn't mean they want to use that terminology, but it doesn't mean they don't want to talk about the concepts. So just keep that in mind. So how do you create a foundation for equitable messaging? The first step is to know your audience and to identify their values. So that's going to go back to Jean's presentation later this morning about moral foundations theory. You also want to focus on places, systems, or conditions and incorporate storytelling. You heard Elizabeth talk about this. And the important things, you want to be authentic, be aware of your own limitations, but also your audience's limitations. And you want to understand the opposition. And I have the green and purple people, and they have opposite colored bubbles. And I was thinking about like doing that intentionally because I wanted to think about the idea, and I want you to think about the idea of speaking someone else's language. So let's start out with knowing your audience. So the first thing is to identify what your audience values. And again, that's the moral foundations theory, the moral foundations. And I'm going to have a slide that shows those, but you want to appeal to one of those values. You also want to know what your audience tipping point is. I like to share this book because it's one of my favorite books, and it's a really great read. It's The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And it talks about how epidemics of all kinds start. And for public health folks, you'll find this book interesting because he talks about an epidemic of syphilis in Baltimore in the 90s. He talks about, why that happens and ways that the epidemic tipped. He also talks about suicide and teen smoking. So you'll find it interesting as a public health practitioner. And then you want to think about like, why are you even trying to reach people? You want to change their knowledge? Do you want them to do something specific and change their behavior? So just be clear on that as you craft your message. And then I think it's important to remember that when we use the word audience or we think about communications, that like these tips apply to talking to your neighbor too, right? You can have an audience of one person. So there are different ways to visualize and understand your audience. And these are a couple of options. There are lots of options out there. At the bottom is a stakeholder management model. So you might be resistant, on the left to champion or unaware. The bottom one takes into account people who are unaware to leading. And one of the things I like to share with people is that, studies of social justice movements show that, movements are not created by always speaking to the people who are your champions and your advocates and your leaders. Your movements are created when you tip people in the middle. So go back to the idea of from the tipping point, right? So we're reaching those people who can help join the movement and advance the movement. So that's who we're trying to reach. We're trying to reach people who are curious, who are aware, who may be neutral, who might be supportive. And then I put a little asterisk next to unaware, because this is a group of people that just also, like people who are resistant, maybe just need a different message. And resistant is something where, you're going to try not to engage, in the sense that, someone who doesn't think COVID is real is going to be very hard to convince otherwise. So why would you put your energy into doing that? You're not going to get them to join the movement, right? But you can get these people in the middle. The other thing is to be conscious of not allowing that kind of ideology of resistant people to seep into the people in the middle. And that is actually reflected here on this slide. I was really fortunate to recently stumble on this presentation from the Opportunity Agenda that came out in 2019. And what they did was conduct a national poll. And the poll basically said, who's the base, who's the opposition, and who is persuadable. And they found that, and you can look for more detail in the report. So they found that the base was about 33% of the people polled, and the opposition was about 17%. But people who were considered persuadable was 50% of the study, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. And they have the demographics of these different groups. But one thing that they note is that persuadables mostly reflect the demographics of registered voters, with a slight lean toward Latinx people. And the other thing they point out that's important is that people who can be persuaded often hold beliefs from both the base and the opposition. So it's important to keep that in mind, right? So you're trying to tip people. Remember that they might think about things in the same way as someone who's resistant, but they might also have some beliefs that align with people who are advocates and champions. So now that we know a little more, we want to do these 3 things here. We want to assume that most of us want the same things. We want to identify how other people define the same concepts, and we want to engage using language that is relevant to their perspective. And to, like what Elizabeth said at the end, think about what they want, not what you want. And one really great illustration of this is arguments for minimum wage. What does this look like in practice? So on the left are some reasons that people might support a higher minimum wage. I'll point out 2. 1, reduced reliance on public benefits. That's a more conservative argument. In the bottom bullet, Black, Hispanic, and Latino and Indigenous employees will see reductions in pay disparity. Tends to be a little bit more of a liberal flavor. And then I include this image on the right from Lee Drutman on Twitter. And it says, if you're trying to make sense of Florida's vote to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and to re-elect Trump, I'd like to remind you of the upper left-hand quadrant of this chart I made back in 2017. Lots of voters are socially conservative and economically liberal.
Okay.
Why does this matter?
So I'm on, it's backstage.
Messaging often targets blue and red, right? The lower left and the upper right quadrants, but not the mixed quadrant. But something obviously clicked here with this group of voters, and we all know they do not value the same things. The arguments on the left here, you see, each of those appeal to different voters in different ways. And so it's important that you understand the different ways that people can value the same thing. So these folks in the upper left quadrant all valued a higher minimum wage, but I can guarantee you it was not for the same reason. So this one is my favorite. And this is to focus on systems, places, or conditions. And what does that look like? Instead of saying African-American people in this community have more cases of COVID-19, consider saying COVID-19 is more common in communities that have a higher risk of asthma and COPD due to environmental hazards. Another example that is probably very familiar to public health folks is African Americans in this community have higher rates of diabetes, where a better alternative might be diabetes is more common in neighborhoods that don't have access to healthy foods. Why do we want to take this kind of stance? Because focusing on people can reinforce ideas that disparities exist due to personal failings or poor choices, when it's really the systems, conditions, and places that create the inequities that we see. Additional examples on the left is Brittany James. She is a physician and founder of the Institute for Anti-Racism in Medicine. And she says, instead of the healthcare community asking how we can get Black folks to trust us, we should instead be asking, how do we become trustworthy? So you build trust and begin the process of racial healing by acknowledging the behavior and your role in the problem, focusing on what the system needs to do to change. And then on the right is one of my favorite articles from last summer. It's in the New York Times, and it's how decades of racist housing policy left neighborhoods sweltering. We know that redlining has left communities of color in areas where they have less tree cover, less access to green spaces, more concrete, et cetera. And that means that those communities are hotter than surrounding communities, and we also know that creates other health risks and chronic can contribute to chronic illness. So the other one I want to point out is the CDC's recent mask wearing guidance. This is just my personal opinion, but it is mind-boggling to me from a public health perspective to say your health is in your hands. The message that came out was you get vaccinated, you wear a mask. And I kind of feel like, no, my health is in your hands. We need to be putting out better policy. We don't need to be telling people that they control, their own health outcomes. We know there's so much more that goes into how COVID is affecting people and who it's affecting to put out such simplistic idea of, that your health is in your own hands. So you heard Elizabeth talk about storytelling, and I'm not going to linger on this slide. And I totally love the ER example. I do like to share that one as well. I just want to point out a couple of quick things. One is I heard this phrase and now it has stuck with me ever since I heard it, which is people want to know that you care before they care what you know. So that's the third point on this screen here. And the other thing is that the story is the story, but how you tell the story and who you tell it to can change. I will point out there is a free CDC training on storytelling for public health if you're interested in learning more about this. And the bottom line is that if you are being equitable, you're caring about people first. Then you bring in all your data and other information. So here are all the ways that you can use storytelling. I just want to give you two examples. One is on the right here is Brandon Boulware, and I might have pronounced his last name wrong. I apologize if I did, but he testified about his transgender daughter and her brother playing in their front yard, and his daughter was wearing a dress. And the neighbor kids asked if she and her brother wanted to play. And I think her father was hesitant or something like that. And so then she asked if she went inside and put on boy clothes, could she go to the neighbor's house to play? And it was really powerful because he said he was teaching his daughter that being good is the same as being someone else and teaching her to deny who she was. And he said that was a day that changed everything for her. And if you haven't watched it, this video is available online. It was really just powerful to think about the ways in which these small things add up and shape our own perceptions of ourselves and the way that we interact with others. And hopefully you remember the impact of these kinds of laws on transgender youth. This is another example. I won't go into the whole story because I want to make sure that we have some time in the end, but it's really cool if you don't follow Humans of New York. I just plug them because I think it restores my faith in humanity. But this was a really cool story about bone donation. And I didn't even know you could donate bone, but it affected this young girl's life. And I remember this story and I tell it to everyone because I think it's a powerful public health perspective about the importance of organ tissue donation. So now we're going to get into being authentic. And so there are some different ways you can do that, but you want to, number one, be yourself, talk in a way that is authentic to you, but also meaningful to your audience. If that's not you, you want to engage trusted community partners to deliver the message. Make sure that you're using translators and interpreters for the languages in your community. I'm from New Mexico. There's a large Asian American and Asian population in Albuquerque metro area. And so they recently hosted some town halls. I think they hosted one in Mandarin and Vietnamese. And you wouldn't think that New Mexico, that you might do that. But yes, because there's a large population there that we want to make sure that we're reaching. And you want to center the voices of impacted community members. I think that's probably the most important. And so resources that help to do that on the right here, the conversation between us about us, which is Black Health to the Black community about COVID vaccines. And on the bottom is from Salud America. And it's their campaign. And I think it's called Juntos We Can Stop the Spread of COVID-19. And so that's also a good resource. You can find their toolkit online. And I love this. And I wish we could talk about cognitive biases in more detail, but here are some things that you should be aware of, both for yourself and for your audience. So confirmation bias, which is we tend to find and remember information that confirms our own perceptions, right? We will remember things as true if it confirms our predisposed notions of what's right. And you're going to hear Jean talk about that as it relates to moral foundations theory. And a recent example of that, I don't know about y'all, if you saw the article about the NFL and the lawsuit for Black players who are alleging that the scoring algorithm for who has dementia assumes that Black men have lower cognitive skills. Therefore, they have to score significantly higher than white players to basically meet the same standard for this dementia scoring tool. So they're almost never getting the same kind of awards. And to me, that harkens back to slave days when we said, that Black people weren't as intelligent or Black people weren't as, on the same level as white people. And the fact that it exists, in this recent example from the NFL is appalling. But that is a type of confirmation bias. That if you have that belief, then you take actions that reinforce that belief. In-group favoritism, which is not always a bad thing, right? We like our groups and we like people in our groups, but you can leverage the strength of those groups and the group relationships. The framing effect. I love the book Freakonomics. If you haven't read it, also a very cool book, but they talk about statistics and the author makes some good points about how we present data. And the one I always remember is he's like 1 in 4 Black men are in prison. But of course, that means 3 in 4 Black men are not. So, that's an asset framing perspective. Do you focus on the negative? Do you focus on the positive? Or another example was murders increased 100% in the last year, which you're like, that sounds terrible. Unless you only had 1 murder last year, and then this year you had 2. So that's a little less terrible. Murder, of course, is terrible. But the point is playing with the numbers. And then authority bias. People are slower to question people who are positions of authority, especially if that person is confident and comfortable in that authority. So I think I'm going to skip this poll, but the idea is to get you thinking, racial equity doesn't sit comfortably with everyone. So what is something that you think of when you hear the term racial equity? So there's a poll. I'm going to actually just skip that to get through to the end. And these are some tips on cognitive bias and racial equity specifically. And what are, basically the question is, what are your own strongly held beliefs and practices? So when you think about each of these biases, ask yourself, what do you think about people of color? What do you think about people of different abilities? What groups do you belong to and how diverse are they? Do you notice that in other settings? I remember watching a news press conference with the Governor DeSantis here in Florida, and he was meeting with brewers, local brewers, and all of them were white men. But there are women brewers here and people of color who are brewers. And so I just found it really interesting that was the panel he chose to pull together. So ask yourself, how observant are you of those things? Again, what kind of spin are you putting on the data and why are you doing it? And then, of course, always try to identify, who do people in your target group trust? Think about your organization. Do people trust your organization? And then harking back to Brittany James. And if they don't trust your organization, then what are you doing to build that trust? Another important cognitive bias is groupthink. And what I wish we could spend a ton of time on this, but the main thing I want to emphasize here is that I heard David R. Williams, who's a professor at Harvard and also does lots of other amazing things. And he said that I remember him saying this, he said, racism harms white people too by placing an upper limit on health. And I always remember that because I think we get into this argument, you hear people say racial equity is not a zero-sum game. And what that means is that, one group doesn't have to be losing something for another group to win, right? Racial equity benefits all of us by lifting all of us up. And I am doing the 21-day challenge right now, which is you read, listen to, or do some other racial article yesterday about how the concept of white was created. And he said, it was really interesting. He was like, why don't I have a hoverboard and, and I'm not living on Alpha Centauri right now? And he said, that's because think of how many people, could have invented something, could have created, the circumstances for that to exist, but they were too busy trying to figure out, where their next meal was coming from and how to maintain their housing to give attention to those things, right? So I think if we make sure everyone is in a better position, we all as a society benefit from that. This is just really quick. Another important thing is myth busting. This is an image from the paper, which is cited there below, but this was this really great study that looked at how people perceived myths versus facts. And basically the bottom line of this study is to lead with facts and try not to put out the myths, because I remember I was at a training on the Frameworks Institute, and they said in some groups, not only did the groups think the myth was the fact, they attributed it to the CDC. So be very careful if this is something that you want to put out there. Okay, so I will skip this poll also, but I do want to say that you want to understand the opposition. And so that means understanding other people's arguments. So when you think about racial equity, you need to understand, what are people saying who are struggling with the idea of racial equity or who are opposed to racial equity? We've all heard in the news people say, well, we had Obama and he was a Black president, as though that solves all of our problems. But people who say that have a certain mindset. So get at what other beliefs do they have about where we are in the fight for equality? So I'm getting toward the end here, and I think I'm good on time. Yes. So we're going to put it all together. So you're going to lead with values, and those are care, liberty, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And these are the moral foundations that Jean's going to get into. You're going to connect to history or other relevant facts as you develop your message. You're going to draw a through line to the issue today, and then you're going to focus on solutions and how they benefit the audience. And so one example I like to share is here in St. Petersburg, the Major League Baseball team, Tampa Bay Rays, play at Tropicana Fields. Tropicana Field exists on a site that was once a thriving Black community here in St. Petersburg. And of course, people, if you're a baseball fan, you know that Tampa has been in negotiations. The team has been in negotiations to move their stadium, but there's also talk about how to redevelop the area around the stadium. And one important part of that process is, number one, to know the history and the community that was affected by developing the stadium in the first place, and two, engaging community voices in reviewing and approving the redevelopment proposals. So that's absolutely something that no matter what organization you were in, you can think of, like, how do you better engage the community in these kinds of conversations and make sure that you're clearly addressing the historical impacts of actions that have been taken that have been detrimental to people of color or other marginalized groups. And I just would emphasize that solutions should be asset-based and focus on collective rather than individual solutions, going back to the idea of we're focusing on systems here. We're focusing on conditions. We're focusing on places. We're not trying to say individuals are going to solve all of our public health problems. So in order to craft a message, I will do this poll. And where do we start? So when you're going to hear more about what each of these moral foundations means, but what I'm going to ask you to do is to think about, I don't know if you can, normally I'm able to put into the text box the 6 values, but I would ask you, what are other words you associate with each of the moral foundations? So when you hear the word care, what are other words you associate with care? Same thing with liberty, with fairness, loyalty, authority, or sanctity. Any of those words, what are some words that you might associate with them? With those words, and let's see if people have some ideas on that. So I'm going to enter, and it will come up as a word cloud if you submit something. Okay, justice. To go along with fairness, are there other words that people might associate with? Nice, compassion. So it's care, liberty, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity. When I think of sanctity, I think sacred. You might think of concern. Concern is a good one. Let's see, we got honesty. That's a good one. Equity, of course. Great, is a great one. Truth, compassion. And what just pops up? Love. That's a good one. Right, compassion is good when you frame messages like we have compassion for our neighbors. We want people to feel safe. Safety, that's a good one. Oh, these are great. Balance, that's good. I love how it switches, but then I'm like, wait, which one did I already read? Choice, thank you, whoever put choice. We hear that a lot with COVID. It's your choice. I want to make my own choices. You can't tell me what to do. My choices affect other people. Yes, sacred. Yeah. Concern. These are fantastic. And so the reason that I'm asking you to think about this is because when you frame your message, you're like, well, how do I frame a message that centers on the moral foundation of care? Well, you're going to use some words that you think are associated with care. So I'm going to move on and say, what do we do? Number one, we're going to identify what our audience cares about, and we're going to use words associated with the moral foundations. Number two, we're going to identify the current issue, and we're going to ask, how are we failing to meet whatever value we identified, and what actions do we need to take to be consistent with that value? Next, we're going to connect to other historical issues or relevant facts. So, right, what's the context and what are ways we can address this? And then we always want to identify a solution. So, what are the benefits to the group? As Elizabeth pointed out, what are the benefits of doing what's asked? So, I am going to do another quick poll because I think we have time, and I think this is the last one anyways. But which moral foundation, so care, liberty, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and you'll see them on the slide, which of these do you think is most likely to come up in a discussion about vaccine hesitancy? You can pick one. Care, okay. All right, we got a couple of liberties. And authority, okay. More liberty. Ooh, liberty strong. And care, liberty and care. Okay. Oh, I see a lot of people on authority, right? Authority, that's true. I mean, when you talk about, requirements for vaccines, for example, authority comes into play. So it looks like people are leaning, generally, a lot of people who are responding at least are leaning toward liberty, but care is strong and so is authority. So I'm going to show you an example using care and fairness. Care, liberty, and fairness. Liberty is also in here, so free from harm, right? Everyone, so what are our values? Everyone deserves a fair and just opportunity to be healthy, free from the harm that COVID has caused for so many of us, our friends, families, and neighbors. So what's the issue? That means that we need to make sure that people in communities who may be at risk are protected and that everyone can access the vaccine. What's the context of this issue? People of color are experiencing barriers to access, including poorly located sites, online-only signups, appointment requirements, transportation issues. Then you can include specific data about your communities. And then you want to identify a solution. We can expand access to the vaccine by offering mobile vaccination sites and pop-up clinics insert information about your communities. We can also allow walk-ups and provide transportation options like shuttles, free Uber and Lyft rides, etc. You've seen that in the news too. The federal government, I think, is supporting free rides to vaccines with Uber or Lyft in a partnership. So this is the same message, but the difference is the context. So this specifically focuses on transportation access. So the only difference is the third section, which is people who don't have cars or access to public transportation may not be able to get to the COVID-19 vaccination sites. And then we want to share data about those communities. And then importantly, we want to end with how we can make sure people get access. So you can hone in on an issue, like I just did here, transportation. You could talk more broadly about it. You can apply this framework to basically any topic. I've done this with broadband access in North Carolina. I've done this with the vaccine timeline, so people who have questions about the rollout. So these are just examples. And I'm going to end, I have 2 slides, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So this 10 essential public health services, and this is equitable communication, thinking of it as an essential public health service. And this ties together really everything that I try to emphasize when I give this presentation, which is accessibility, credibility, knowing your audience, engaging the community, and taking an asset-based perspective. So I hope those are things that you take away from this, and you take some time to go back and look at these resources, like look at the updated 10 essential public health services and learn more about how it was reframed. And then this is a summary of the things that I talked about that I also, you'll have a copy of this that are just a quick kind of glance at the things that you need to keep in mind. Leading with values, knowing your audience, engage trusted messengers and impacted community members, storytelling, systems, conditions, and places over individuals, asset-based perspective, be empathetic. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your section. Being aware of cognitive biases, both for yourself and for your audience, and be authentic. So that is it for me. And so if you have questions or comments, I think if you have it, we have a chat that functions very similar to Zoom. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then I'm going to come on video so that we can do questions. So thank you for your time. And I think we have, if I'm timing that correct, right? I think we have till 10:15. So, so hopefully we can answer some questions if there are any from the audience. Let's see. Oh yes, I see. Thank you, Michael. Said 10:15 is correct. Please enter your questions here in the event chat. Thank you for participating in the polls. We always like to do a little bit more interactive activities when we can. Also think about how you apply the information that you're hearing. And I apologize if you guys can hear buzzing in the background. There's work going on outside of my house today.
I have work going on inside of my house, so I may have to mute and unmute periodically. I want to give a shout out to Samantha, who talked about her success in convincing someone or someone's to get the vaccine. And she said she did it with building relationships with clients / families she's been working with, listening and validating their concerns, and talking with them multiple times about that. That is just completely on point in terms of being an empathetic messenger and being in that long game, public health, being engaged with the community and showing up over and over again and validating all that kind of stuff. So just like hitting it on all the fronts. So that's awesome.
Elizabeth, I liked your poll. I think that we often think about, when we hear about people not wanting to get the vaccine, we automatically go to, this concept of anti-vaxxers, which I think we're trying to get away from using that term, right? Are you people who are just resistant to, public health interventions? But then I like to talk about my brother, who is an emergency department nurse, who is hesitant to get the vaccine. And it's because he has seen, granted he works in an emergency department, he has seen a lot more adverse reactions to the vaccine. And he's also exposed to COVID all the time, because that's where patients in his community where he lived come in for care. And so he's like, I've been working with COVID patients for the entire pandemic, and I'm exposed to COVID all the time. And also I see people who are not, who are getting the vaccine and it's not working out well for them. So he's really has some reservations about getting the vaccine, but it's an ongoing conversation with him.
Yeah. It's interesting. The New York Times article that I linked to in the stage chat has this breakdown of different 4 different groups that they've identified or that this person has identified as the vaccine hesitant. And some of them are the super resistant. And some of them are the, it costs too much, either time and money. And then some of them are the wait and seers. Which is, it's a really interesting op-ed. It was great timing this morning. I was like showing it to my husband, at like 6:45. I was like, look at this. And he was like, why are you so excited about this? I was like, because I'm talking about it in like 2 hours. But I definitely recommend checking it out. You can even enter your state, and like they have some polling data that sort of shows like a breakdown of, what they see as like the most predominant groups in North Carolina. But it's great because it's like, if you're talking about like the very hesitant, like they didn't like want to wear masks even, and they've got strategies for talking to these folks. So like for those people that are saying like, the messenger is really important. And who do those folks trust? Like, do they trust their doctors? Like, they might trust their doctors, and that's where like those GOP doctor PSAs would be really effective. Like, someone from the public health department probably going to be like a really ineffective messenger, and like recognizing that is, I think, a really important thing for us to recognize. Like, and I think you do a really good job talking about this, Dawn. Like knowing like who should go speak to an audience, and like us being humble about that, because like we tend to think that we know a lot, and we do, but knowing when we're not the right person is really important. And it looks like Mike has a really good question about that. So can we talk more about who the messenger is, e.g. government officials, how that can affect how the message is received from a moral foundations lens, and what we can do about it. So yeah, I think so. I've sort of talked about it a little bit, so maybe Dawn wants to jump in, but I think really like public health can't operate in a vacuum, and I think having really strong partnerships is so crucial, and it's crucial all the time. But like from a moral foundations lens, I think like leveraging like for authority, for example, like knowing who has authority and where and with whom. Would be like, that's one thing that comes to my mind is like, people talk a lot about like, oh, the churches have authority, but like, and they do with some groups, but I also think like we're kind of quick to jump to them. Whereas like, I always think about when I was first researching who has authority, I went to the Pew Research Center and to see who's considered a trusted messenger, just sort of across the board. School principals have very high levels of trust. So, don't neglect some of these like maybe slightly less traditional messengers in your community. Dawn, I'm gonna let you talk about that now, if you have some other things.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's important to make sure that you are identifying your group values over public health values first. It's really hard because, you might want to go to authority, you might want to go to care. But I think, identifying what the group values are and then seeing how they align with yours is kind of the first step. The other thing is, I also agree with Elizabeth that partnerships are critical, and I don't know that we leverage them enough, especially from an advocacy perspective in public health. I remember listening to Jerome Adams, our past Surgeon General, but when he was the Commissioner of Health in Indiana, I remember him talking, and he said something like, I saw him at a conference, and he said something like, we whisper in the ears of our friends, right? So some of that is public health may have its hands tied in the kinds of messages that it can put out. And so it's important for us to make sure our partners are equipped with the information to get the message out. And to get accurate information out and to tell the story in a way that matters to the communities that are getting the message.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, like we might have funding restrictions on something, and so like we can't provide a service directly or say a message as directly as we'd like, but somebody else might have more freedom and more liberty to do that.
Elizabeth, oh, sorry. I was going to say, in the stage chat, I want to ask Carol, who said, are you aware of efforts of people of color being given additional opportunities to lead? And I wonder if you're thinking in a particular setting, Carol, or just in general, and if you could put that in the chat. And while you do that, Catherine also made a note, use the term focus, not target, when discussing interventions and collaboration. I just want to call that out. It's a good piece of advice. I actually try to catch myself. One of the things I had been in the habit of saying is like, we want to use trusted messengers, and I don't like the word use. And so you want to engage trusted messengers. You want to empower, you want to uplift, equip messengers with the information they need, but we don't want to use people. So just in general. Okay, so the question is, are you aware of efforts of people of color being given additional opportunities to lead? Well, one is the COVID-19 Disparities Task Force, which is very diverse and led by a Black woman. I believe she's a physician, and forgive me if I just don't know this off the top of my head, but I think that's great because we see, of course, the impact of COVID on people of color across the US. And so to have a team of people who reflect the diversity of the populations that are impacted, I think is really important. Elizabeth, do you have any examples that you want to share?
I feel like I hear a lot of informal examples, and I'm thinking of, even just things like super specifically, like in Granville Vance, I know that when we were helping, we were partnering with them on some messaging in earlier in the pandemic. I know that we were sharing some PSAs, and I know that they had some partnerships with some local leaders of color who, were sharing, kind of like messages about like staying home and masking and stuff like that. But I feel like that's not kind of high level enough in terms of like, like state leadership and stuff like that. I feel like the problem, and I feel like this language is I've learned people identify with those who look like them. I worry that we do too much leverage. I feel like I'm going to get in trouble. I worry that we do too much leveraging of like, oh, we just need a messenger who looks like this group to go talk to them. And that's the only way that we engage. And we don't do a good enough job in public health of saying, of lifting up leaders in general, who are amazing and talented, and just saying like, this, we need to have you leading in, all the time. So I feel like, I guess what I'm trying to say is unfortunately, Carol, not too many come to mind readily. And I wish that I'm ashamed that I don't have too many examples to give you. I'm sure that there are more examples. I just don't know of any personally. I think that what we need to do though is like, instead of being like, how can we find the right messenger for this group, be more like, not like, to speak to your point, Dawn, we're not using people. We are, already in partnership with amazing people from many diverse backgrounds and communities. And we are already like in a strong network where we have, partners and messengers ready to go. That's what we need.
So I want to add really quickly to this discussion to say, Carol, one thing that comes to mind, then there is an example from Buncombe County, North Carolina, and other communities across the US, is community conversations. So that is a tool where community members are empowered to lead and equipped with information to lead conversations about important issues affecting the community, and helping to inform kind of decisions about policy. And so I think that is a great example. The other thing I think is, in addition to people identifying with people who look like them, remember groupthink bias. People identify with people in their group, right? So that group might be your race or ethnicity, but it's also your church, it's your sports team, it's your neighborhood that you live in. I'm in St. Petersburg, Florida. There's neighborhoods everywhere. I live in Magnolia Heights. Right next to me is Allendale, to this side, Woodlawn to the right. I mean, and people identify with these little communities that they live in. And so I think that is another point of consideration. It's like when we think about, who goes out, and you think about community health workers, they're people from the community who may look exactly like the people that they're serving, but they may look different, but they have the same experience because they grew up and live and experience the same community conditions that the people they are trying to help are experiencing. I mean, Crystal, yeah, for sure. I mean,
I think this is one of those, COVID has, not exposed, like we didn't already know that these were issues, but like has really highlighted many ways in which like we have systemic things we need to address in public health and in the country at large, that we need to be doing a much better job of. We should have these systems in place. We should be uplifting. We need to be getting out of the way, is how I feel a lot of the time. When I say we, I mean like, white people. but I also just feel like public health in general has this like very like, it can get a little like, sort of hierarchical, patriarchal, like we know it's best for you. And that's very off-putting in general. But also like, it's not true engagement. It's not empathetic. It's not good communication, and it's like, why would people listen to that? So like we need to be like forming like deeper relationships, and we need to be like forming relationships with more kinds of people. And whether that's, across generations or across different races and ethnicities, or across, geographic kind of divides. I mean, this applies in a lot of different ways. This is something we need to be working on. And when we have a crisis, this just gets really exposed. So.
I just wanted to add to that I recently finished a certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And, we talked, one of the modules talked extensively about, who leads diversity initiatives in an organization, right? And so you see a lot of people of color being selected to be chief diversity officer, chief equity officer, and et cetera. And that's great. But then those people are often not also empowered to actually make real change in their organizations. And so from an organizational perspective, and this goes to health departments too, right? If you have an equity officer, some health departments are creating these positions. So you have an office of health equity already, is that you have to systematize and operationalize equity in your organization. And it has to be, everyone has to be bought in, and leadership, middle managers, frontline workers, and be really intentional about how that happens. So you can't just create a position and say, please lead diversity initiatives for us, and then be surprised when that person is struggling because you haven't equipped the organization to engage. So it's, it's a longer conversation. There are strategies to do that, but I think that's important because we have to question our own organizations, not just our employers, but anywhere we interact with people, right? If you give money to a company and you go out and shop, and you shop at Target, does Target have good diversity initiatives? Does Amazon? So think about, the economic power, your buying power, and how we hold accountable these great influences on our society, right? So I could just go on about that forever, but I think we're at time. Is Michael on the line here? Okay, yes, it is time.
This is a really great discussion, and I think we could talk about this for days and days and days. And I'll acknowledge my limited experience in the field of DEI, but these are all really, and I appreciate y'all bringing them up. So thank you.
Yes, thank you both. I'm hesitant to even interject here because this is a great Q&A session, and a certainly wonderful presentation by both of you. Thank you again, Donna and Elizabeth, for taking the time to be with us and your flexibility as we adjusted with the technical issues. We really appreciate all of your perspective and expertise here. So we are going to break. We'll come back at 10:30 with Jean Matthews, who is online. We will try to get you unmuted, Jean, and we'll see you all back in about 10 minutes.